The beggar's hand trembled as it reached for a single coin, and the woman who dropped it never saw the empire behind his eyes. Seo Junwoo had buried $3 billion, a boardroom empire, and a name that made grown men bow, all to find out one thing. Would she love him with nothing? What she did next didn't just shock him. It shattered every wall he'd built to survive. Welcome to Afro-Korea TV. Please like, share, and subscribe. Rain fell over Seoul in thin silver threads, blurring the neon skyline into watercolor. Under the awning of Cheongdam Station, a man in a torn coat sat with his knees pulled to his chest, a chipped bowl in front of him. His face was smudged with soot, his hair matted, his eyes sharp as knives beneath the grime. No one who passed him would have guessed that 3 floors above, his name was etched in gold on the tallest building in the district, Seo Junwoo, chairman of Seo Dynamics, one of the richest men in Korea. He was not begging for money. He was begging for the truth. 3 days earlier, Junwoo had sat across from his grandfather in a room lined with portraits of ancestors who had built empires from nothing. Marry Felicia, the old man had said, but marry her knowing who she really is. Test her. If she loves the money, end it before the wedding. If she loves you, his grandfather's eyes had softened, just slightly, then you'll have found something I never did. Junwoo had not answered right away. He loved Felicia. He was almost certain of it. But almost certain was not enough when it came to a lifetime. Felicia had grown up 2 subway stops from the slums, in a one-room apartment where the heater broke every winter and her mother worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on. She had clawed her way into a marketing position at a mid-tier firm, and somehow, through a chance meeting at a charity gala she'd crashed for the free food, she had caught the eye of the most eligible bachelor in Korea. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of 5-star restaurants and quiet, unexpected kindnesses. He remembered her coffee order after one conversation. He sent his driver to pick up her mother from chemotherapy appointments without being asked. He never once made her feel like the poor girl who didn't belong in his world. She loved him. She was sure of that. But sometimes, late at night, she wondered what would happen if the money disappeared. Would he still look at her the way he did now? She was about to find out the answer belonged to both of them. The next day, Junwoo took his position outside the cafe, where Felicia stopped every morning for her Americano before work. He had studied her routine for weeks, not out of obsession, but out of the quiet, devoted attentiveness that came so naturally to him when it came to her. He knew she left her apartment at 7:40. He knew she always paused at the flower stand to smell the gardenias, even though she never bought them. He lowered his head as she approached, holding out the chipped bowl. "Spare some change." His voice was rough, disguised, but his heart pounded like a war drum. Felicia slowed. Most people walked past beggars without a glance. Seoul had grown numb to the sight. But she crouched, meeting his eyes, and something in her chest tightened at the hollow look in them. "Here," she said, pressing a few coins into his palm, her fingers brushing his. "It's not much, but get something warm to eat, okay?" He almost broke character right there. Almost. Later that night, alone in her apartment, Felicia couldn't stop thinking about the beggar's eyes. There had been something achingly familiar in them, an intensity, a sadness that didn't belong on the street. She shook the thought away, telling herself she was imagining things, that stress from the upcoming wedding was making her see ghosts. She didn't know that 3 miles away, Junwoo sat in his penthouse, staring at the coins she'd given him, turning them over and over in his hands like they were more precious than any diamond in his vault. A few days later, Junwoo returned to the same corner, this time in worse condition, deliberately so. He needed to see how far her kindness would stretch. This time, when Felicia approached, she wasn't alone. Her co-worker, Daniel, a smooth-talking account manager who had been flirting with her for months, walked beside her, his hand hovering too close to her back. "Come on, Faye, ignore him," Daniel said, glancing at the beggar with distaste. "You can't save every stray in Seoul." Something dark and possessive coiled in Junwoo's chest, an emotion so foreign to the disguise he wore that he nearly forgot himself. He watched Daniel's hand drift toward the small of Felicia's back and had to physically restrain the urge to break every finger on it. But Felicia stepped away from Daniel's touch without seeming to notice she'd done it, and crouched again in front of Junwoo. "Are you eating?" she asked softly. "You look thinner than last time." "I manage," he rasped. She pulled a warm bun from her bag, her own breakfast, he realized, and pressed it into his hands. "Take this, please." Daniel scoffed and walked ahead, clearly annoyed. Felicia lingered a moment longer, studying the beggar's face like she was trying to solve a puzzle she couldn't name. Then she smiled, small, warm, real, and hurried to catch up with her coworker. Junwoo sat there long after she'd disappeared into the crowd, the bun growing cold in his hands, his heart anything but. By the end of the week, Junwoo had learned things about Felicia that his money and his private investigators never could have told him. He learned that she gave away her lunch more often than she ate it. He learned that she stopped to help an elderly street vendor pack up his cart every single evening, rain or shine. He learned that she never once looked at him, at this broken, filthy version of him, with disgust. He had also learned something else. Watching Daniel's hands near her, watching other men's eyes linger too long as she passed, ignited something violent and possessive in him that he'd spent years training himself to suppress in boardrooms and negotiations. Out here, stripped of his name and his money, he had nothing to hide behind. The jealousy was raw, unfiltered, terrifying in its intensity. He decided that night he could not do this much longer without her knowing. But fate, as it often does in Seoul's underbelly, had other plans. Junwoo's rival at CO Dynamics, a cousin named Han Tae-min who had been quietly maneuvering to seize control of the company for years, had noticed the chairman's mysterious absences. Tae-min's men tracked Junwoo's movements and, within days, discovered his elaborate disguise and his connection to a woman named Felicia. Tae-min smiled coldly at the information. If he couldn't destroy Junwoo through the boardroom, perhaps he could destroy him through his heart. The following morning, Felicia received a call from an unknown number. A man's voice, smooth and clinical, informed her that her fiancé, CO Junwoo, had been playing a cruel game with her, that the beggar she'd been feeding all week was, in fact, the very man she was set to marry, testing her like a lab rat. Felicia's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped her phone. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. "Because you deserve to know the truth," Tae-min said smoothly, though his motives were anything but noble. "Ask him yourself. See if he denies it." The line went dead. That evening, Felicia stood outside the cafe, watching the corner where the beggar always sat. He wasn't there. She waited nearly an hour in the cold, her mind spinning through the memories of every conversation, every glance, every small kindness she thought she'd freely given a stranger. If it was true, if the man she'd been feeding scraps to was Junwoo himself, then everything about their relationship had been a test she never knew she was taking. And worse, he had let her believe, for days, that she was helping a starving stranger while he sat there in his disguise, watching her, judging her, deciding whether she was worthy. She didn't know whether to feel touched or utterly betrayed. She confronted him that night at his penthouse, her eyes red-rimmed, her voice trembling with a fury she rarely let herself feel. "Is it true?" she demanded the moment he opened the door. "Were you the beggar? Were you testing me this whole time?" Junwoo's face, clean now, sharp-jawed and unmistakably himself, went pale. He hadn't planned for her to find out this way, hadn't planned for someone to rip the truth from beneath him before he could offer it with his own hands, gently, the way he'd intended. "Felicia. Answer me." Her voice cracked. "Yes," he said quietly. "It was me." The silence that followed was worse than any explosion could have been. "Do you know how humiliating this feels?" Felicia's voice shook, tears spilling freely now. "I gave away my breakfast. I worried about you being cold. I thought I was helping someone who had nothing, and the entire time, you were laughing at me from behind a mask, deciding if I passed some test to be your wife." "I wasn't laughing," Junwoo said, stepping toward her, desperation cracking his usually composed voice. "Felicia, I have never been more serious about anything in my life. My grandfather told me to test you before the wedding, to make sure you loved me, and not what I could give you. I almost said no. I should have said no. But you didn't. Her voice was hollow now, exhausted. You put on rags and sat in the rain and let me believe a lie for a week. Because I needed to know, he said, his voice breaking in a way she had never heard from him before. Not because I doubted you, Felicia. Because I doubted myself. I doubted whether I deserved someone like you. Every day you showed up, every day you gave without knowing there was anything in it for you, I fell for you harder than I already had. You didn't fail a test. You destroyed me with how good you are. Felicia stared at him, chest heaving, torn between the ache of betrayal and the undeniable truth ringing in his words. I need space, she finally said and walked out before he could stop her. He let her go that night, a mistake he would spend the rest of the week regretting. Junwoo did not sleep. He sat in the dark of his penthouse, replaying every moment of the past week, cataloging every small, unknowing gift she'd given a man in rags, understanding now with brutal clarity that he had wronged her, not by testing her worth, but by taking away her right to know she was being tested at all. She hadn't gotten the choice to be honest to him. He had stolen that from her. He resolved, in the gray hours before dawn, that he would spend however long it took proving he was not a man who tested and discarded, but a man who would burn his empire to the ground for her, if that's what it took to earn her trust back. He didn't yet know that Han Taemin's game had only just begun. Felicia didn't go home that night. She went to the small apartment she still kept, out of habit and stubborn independence, in the neighborhood where she'd grown up. Her mother, weakened from chemo but sharp as ever, took one look at her daughter's face and set down her teacup. Tell me, her mother said simply. Felicia told her everything. The beggar, the coins, the bun she'd given away, the phone call, the truth. Her mother listened without interrupting, her thin hands folded in her lap. When Felicia finished, her mother sighed, the sound heavy with decades of hard-won wisdom. You're angry because he lied. That's fair. But ask yourself this, my love. In the version of the story where he never told you, where he let you marry him without ever confessing, would you rather have lived that life forever? Or do you understand, somewhere underneath the hurt, why a man who has been surrounded by liars and money chasers his whole life might need proof that you weren't one of them? Felicia said nothing, but the question lodged itself somewhere deep, refusing to let her sleep. By the following morning, word had begun to leak, carefully, deliberately, orchestrated by Han Taemin's people, that Seo Junwoo's fiancée had been seen crying and storming out of his penthouse. Korean tabloids, always hungry for Billionaire scandal, ran headlines within hours. Trouble in paradise? Seo Dynamics airs engagement on the rocks. Taemin smiled as he watched the story spread across financial news tickers, knowing that a distracted, emotionally shattered Junwoo was a vulnerable one, vulnerable enough that the board might finally consider a change in leadership. What Taemin didn't understand was that Junwoo had never been more focused in his life. Heartbreak for a man like him did not create weakness. It created war. Junwoo showed up at Felicia's mother's apartment that afternoon, not in a suit, not with an entourage, but alone, in the same worn coat he'd worn as the beggar. Felicia's mother opened the door before he could knock, as though she'd been expecting him. She's not ready to see you, her mother said gently. I'm not here to see her, Junwoo said, his voice steady despite the storm behind his eyes. I'm here to ask your permission to keep trying. I know I hurt her. I know I have no right to ask for anything. But I love your daughter more than I have ever loved anything in my life, and I will spend as long as it takes proving that to her, if you'll let me. Felicia's mother studied him for a long moment, the same searching look her daughter so often wore. Finally, she stepped aside. She's in the kitchen. Try the truth this time. All of it. Felicia stood at the stove, stirring a pot of soup with unsteady hands, when she felt him enter the room. She didn't turn around. I'm not here to defend what I did, Junwoo said quietly. I was wrong to let you believe a lie, even for a good reason. You deserved honesty from the very first day, not a test disguised as friendship. I should have told you my grandfather's request and let you decide together with me whether we wanted to do it at all. Felicia's shoulders trembled, but she still didn't turn. But I need you to know something else, he continued, his voice raw. Every single kindness you showed that Beggar was real. You didn't know it was me, which means it wasn't performance, it was who you actually are underneath everything. I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who smile at my money and disappear the moment it's gone. I have never, not once, met someone who gave without expecting anything back. You didn't pass a test, Felicia. You revealed a truth about yourself that I already suspected, and that I fell in love with long before I put on that coat. Felicia finally turned, tears streaking silently down her face. You should have trusted me enough to tell me. I know, he said, taking a step closer, close enough now that she could see every ounce of anguish in his eyes. I trust you completely. It was never you I doubted. It was whether I deserved you. And I still don't know the answer to that. But I know I'm not walking away without fighting for the chance to find out. She didn't answer him with words. She answered him by closing the distance between them and letting him wrap his arms around her, the two of them standing in the small kitchen where she'd grown up, the soup forgotten on the stove, both of them breathing like they'd just survived something enormous. I'm still angry, she whispered into his chest. I know, he murmured against her hair. Be angry for as long as you need. I'm not going anywhere. Neither of them noticed. Through the kitchen window, the black sedan parked across the street. One of Han Taemin's men, watching, reporting back every detail of the reconciliation to a man who had already decided that if he couldn't break Junwoo through scandal, he would break him through something far more permanent. That evening, back at the penthouse, the fragile peace between them deepened into something quieter and more tender. Junwoo made her tea the way she liked it, too sweet, the way he'd learned from the barista at her favorite cafe weeks ago without ever mentioning it. They sat together on the terrace overlooking the glittering city, saying little, letting the silence between them heal what words alone could not. Why me? Felicia finally asked, watching the skyline. Out of every woman in Seoul who would have married you without question, why did you choose someone who is going to make you work this hard? Junwoo considered the question seriously, the way he considered every important thing in his life. Because the ones who wouldn't make me work for it were never going to be worth having, he said. You make me earn every smile, every touch, every piece of trust. That's how I know it's real. Felicia leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time since the phone call, she let herself believe that maybe, despite the lie, despite the humiliation, despite everything, this was still the love she'd thought it was. She had no way of knowing that Han Taemin's plan would soon force her to prove her love in a way far more dangerous than feeding a stranger on a street corner. Previously, Seo Junwoo disguised himself as a beggar to test whether Felicia loved him or his money. She passed without knowing she was being tested, but the truth came out through his rival, Han Taemin, who now schemes to destroy them both. A week passed in fragile, healing peace. Felicia moved back into the penthouse, slowly, cautiously, like someone testing ice after a long winter. Junwoo made a point of telling her everything now, every board meeting, every decision, every worry, determined never again to let a single secret stand between them. But Han Taemin was not a patient man, and patience was no longer required. He had gathered enough leverage. It was time to strike. The following Monday, Junwoo sat in an emergency board meeting, blindsided by an audit request Taemin had filed against him, alleging financial mismanagement tied, falsely, to his week-long disappearance as a beggar. The tabloids ran with it instantly. Chairman's bizarre double life raises questions about company funds. It was baseless. It was also enough to rattle the board, enough to buy Taemin the time and votes he needed to call for an emergency leadership review. Junwoo remained calm in the meeting, his voice level, his mind already 3 steps ahead. But calm was a mask. Beneath it, fury simmered, not for himself, but because he knew, with the cold certainty of a chess player watching an opponent's next move unfold, that Taemin would eventually come for the one thing Junwoo actually valued. That evening, Felicia was walking home from a friend's apartment when a black van pulled alongside her on a quiet side street. 2 men stepped out before she could react, one clamping a hand over her mouth, the other seizing her arms. Her phone clattered to the pavement, screen cracking, the last thing visible on it a half-typed text to Junwoo. "Coming home now, love, why?" She was shoved into the van, and within seconds, the street was empty again, as though nothing had happened at all. Junwoo received the call an hour later, not from the kidnappers, but from his head of security, informing him that Felicia's phone had gone dark near her friend's neighborhood and that she'd never arrived home. The composed, controlled businessman who had spent the day fending off a corporate coup vanished entirely. What remained was something far older and far more dangerous, a man whose entire world had just been threatened. "Find her," Junwoo said, his voice a low, lethal calm that made even his most hardened security chief go still. "I don't care what it costs. I don't care who's responsible. Find her now." Within the hour, a message arrived on Junwoo's private line, the number blocked, the voice modulated but unmistakably smug. "You have until midnight tomorrow to resign your position and hand full control of CO Dynamics to me," Taemin said. "Do that and your fiancée comes home untouched. Fight me, involve the police, and I promise you'll never see her again." Junwoo's hand tightened around the phone until the casing cracked. "If you touch one hair on her head," he said, voice shaking with barely restrained violence, "I will burn everything you've ever built to the ground, and I will enjoy every second of it." The line went dead. Taemin had made his first mistake. He had shown his hand to a man with nothing left to lose. Felicia woke in a dim, windowless room, wrists bound loosely to a metal chair, her head throbbing from where she'd struck it during the struggle. Fear coiled tight in her chest, but beneath it, something steadier began to rise. The same steel that had let her survive a childhood of poverty and a mother's illness without breaking. She would not fall apart. Not yet. Not while there was still a way out to find. She listened carefully to the muffled voices beyond the door, memorizing details, an accent, a mention of a warehouse near the docks, the creak of a specific loose floorboard each time someone walked past. If she got even one chance, she intended to be ready. By midnight, Junwoo had not slept, had not eaten, had done nothing but coordinate with his security team and, quietly, without telling anyone, called in favors from contacts his grandfather had spent decades cultivating, men who operated in the spaces between legitimate business and something far more dangerous, men who owed the CO family debts that had nothing to do with money. She was taken by amateurs working for Han Taemin, one of his grandfather's old contacts confirmed over the phone. "Sloppy. Left traces. We have a location near Incheon Docks. Warehouse District." "I'm going," Junwoo said immediately. "Chairman, that's not wise." "I don't care what's wise," Junwoo snapped, already reaching for his coat, the same torn coat he'd worn as a beggar, some instinct telling him he needed to be that version of himself tonight, the man with nothing to protect but everything to lose. "She is not spending one more hour in fear because of me. I'm going, and you're either helping me or getting out of my way." The following morning, before dawn, Junwoo arrived at the warehouse district with a small, tightly coordinated team, men his grandfather trusted, quiet and efficient, nothing like the flashy security detail that usually surrounded him. He moved through the docks like a man who had shed every layer of civility, every ounce of boardroom composure, leaving behind only the raw, singular purpose of a man going to war for the woman he loved. Inside the warehouse, Felicia had used the hours of darkness wisely. She'd worked her wrists loose from the poorly tied rope, hidden the evidence beneath her sleeves, and waited, patient, alert, watching the rotation of her captors, counting their footsteps, memorizing the rhythm of the loose floorboard by the door. When one of the men entered alone to check on her, she didn't hesitate. She swung the metal chair leg she'd quietly worked free hours earlier, striking him hard enough to stagger him, then bolted past him into the dim corridor beyond. She didn't get far before a second man caught her by the arm, but the sound of her scream, sharp, deliberate, unrestrained, cut through the warehouse at the exact moment Junwoo and his team breached the far entrance. What happened next was fast, chaotic, and, for Junwoo, almost entirely without memory afterward, the adrenaline and fury blurring everything into flashes, the sound of Felicia's voice, the sight of a stranger's hand on her, the visceral, animal need to close the distance between them before anything worse could happen. By the time the warehouse fell silent, Taemin's men were subdued, and Junwoo was on his knees in front of Felicia, hands shaking as he checked every inch of her for injuries, his composed billionaire mask utterly, permanently shattered. "I'm okay," Felicia whispered, tears streaming down her face as she gripped the front of his shirt like she never intended to let go. I'm okay, you found me." "I will always find you," he said, voice breaking. "Always. Do you understand me? There is no version of this world where I don't come for you." Han Taemin was arrested within days, the falsified audit unraveling under scrutiny once investigators traced the kidnapping back to his associates. The board, horrified by the scandal, unanimously reaffirmed Junwoo's leadership, offering apologies that he barely registered, his focus entirely elsewhere, on the woman recovering in his penthouse, the woman who had survived being taken from him and had come out of it somehow even more unshakable than before. The tabloids that had once mocked his bizarre double life now ran a different story entirely. Billionaire's desperate rescue. Love story turns real-life thriller. Neither of them cared much for headlines anymore. They cared only for the quiet, ordinary mornings that followed, coffee shared in comfortable silence, hands that no longer let go without reason, a trust rebuilt not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of 1,000 small, honest moments. A month later, on a rooftop overlooking the same skyline where he'd once sat disguised as a stranger, Junwoo got down on one knee, properly this time, without disguise, without secrets, nothing between them but the truth. "I already asked you to marry me once," he said, voice thick with emotion, "but I asked the wrong way. Asked before you knew all of me, and before I understood all of you. So I'm asking again, now with nothing hidden. Felicia, will you marry a man who has already failed you once, and who promises to spend every day after this proving he's worth a second chance?" Felicia, laughing through her tears, pulled him up before he could finish kneeling and kissed him with everything she had. "Yes," she breathed against his lips. "Yes, you impossible, ridiculous man. Yes." Their wedding took place 6 months later, in a garden ceremony far smaller and quieter than anyone expected from Korea's most talked-about billionaire. Felicia's mother, in remission and glowing with health, walked her down the aisle alongside no one. Felicia had insisted on walking herself the final steps, a quiet declaration that she came to this marriage not as someone rescued, but as an equal. Junwoo wept openly as she approached, something the tabloids would talk about for weeks, the untouchable chairman, undone entirely by the sight of the woman he loved in white. "I told you," he whispered as she reached him, "that I would spend every day proving I was worth it." "You already have," she whispered back. "Every single day since that warehouse. I never needed proof, Junwoo. I just needed you to be honest. And you have been." A year later, on a quiet evening on that same terrace where they'd once sat healing in silence, Felicia placed Junwoo's hand gently against her stomach, watching his face carefully. For a moment, the most powerful man in Seoul, the man who had faced down corporate raiders, kidnappers, and his own fractured trust in himself, simply stared, speechless, his eyes filling with tears he made no effort to hide. "We're having a baby," Felicia said softly, smiling through her own tears at the wonder on his face. Junwoo pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the single most precious thing in existence, because to him, she always had been, long before he'd ever tested her, long before a chipped bowl and a torn coat had revealed a truth he'd spent his whole life searching for. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me," he murmured into her hair. "You, and now all of this. I don't deserve it. But I promise you, every single day, I will try to." Outside, the lights of Seoul glittered on, indifferent to the two people on the terrace who had survived deception, danger, and doubt to arrive, finally, at something unshakable. Love, real love, had not needed a test to prove itself. It had simply needed the truth. And in the end, that was the only thing either of them had ever truly wanted from the other. Welcome to Afro Korea TV. Please like, share, and subscribe for more.